What's up, guys? We're back for another faction guide. This time we're talking about Saxony. Now, Saxony is largely considered to be the weakest faction in the base expand, the exception being if there is an Albion player and a Rustfate player, the Nords is the weakest faction in the game, and it's not particularly close. It's a bit unfortunate for the Nords. So why is Saxony considered the weakest faction in the base expand? Well, it's very simple. It's because of a lack of food. Crimea has food here, and Polania has food here. Nords, assuming they don't have both neighbors, has food either here or here. Rustfate has food here. I mean, even the two expansion factions have food in their inner ring here, which means that it's basically theirs. Saxony doesn't have food here. Like, their closest food is right here. And the issue with this food is, well, you're going to have to make some decisions about your game based on getting to this food. Because you're going to have to get onto this village, which means that you either have to, with your first mech, get your speed mech so you can get your character out and pick up the encounter, which is really important, or get your underpass mech, move off of the steel and onto the farm, and then move the rest of the workers with the second mech onto the steel. But that doesn't really work. So let's talk about that very briefly. What I'm really talking about here is your choice. If you're able to deploy a mech first before you take a move action, you have the choice to deploy your underpass mech. And this is a strategy that I didn't kind of figure out until later. So for instance, with this board in particular, you could take a trade action, then you could take a produce action, deploy your underpass mech here. Then with your first move action, you move off of this and onto this, and you move onto the village. And now you're on your farm in the very early game as Saxony, and it's going to allow you to actually play a powerful game. Then you get up to 5 workers, then you get your speed mech as normal. And then your speed mech deploys onto mostly this mountain, but also onto oil if you're able. And by then you'll be getting food in. And then you can get your steel in. It's just going to be a little bit more difficult to get your second mech. So that's option number 1. If you can deploy a fast mech, like with this board, before you get your first movement, then you can get your underpass mech and you can get onto food early. This is going to alleviate a lot of your weakness as Saxony. So keep that in mind. The other option is early on, you move off of your oil and onto the village, and then you start getting up to 5 workers. This is going to be your standard run-of-the-mill build, assuming your mech costs 4 or is just way too inconvenient to get, i.e. I believe patriotic mechs are a bit of a pain in the ass to get early because you have to take a bolster action, which means your workers are going to be a bit slower. Then, assuming you're doing this, we're going to assume you didn't get your underpass mech at this point and move on to the farm and the village. Your priorities are going to be getting up to 5 workers while producing steel as well, and then getting your speed mech first. Why don't you get your underpass mech first? Well, because you have to move your workers. The primary reason for you to get your mechs out early is to move your workers. If you're going to put your underpass mech here, the most you can do with your movement is move this guy onto food and move one of your guys off the village onto the mountain or the oil. This is just not very efficient. Again, it's not actually going to lead to a particularly strong game. So if you put your speed mech on here, then suddenly you can move onto oil and steel as you so choose. And then your second mech is going to be something you're going to power out really quickly. You need your second mech. And then your second mech is underpass. Well, why do you also pick up your encounter with your speed mech first? Well, why don't you get your Riverwalk mech? Well, you can in some circumstances, but this encounter is a bit of a trade-off. If you take your underpass mech second, that means you can actually get your disarm mech third. This disarm mech is very, very crucial to Saxony being able to stay out on the board early game. One of the weaknesses of Saxony is you only start with 1 combat power. 1 combat power is not enough to be out on the board early on. But the problem is you need to be out on the board early on because you need this farm. So being able to get out your disarm mech third will mean that if your opponents attack your farm, they lose 2 combat power, and then with your underpass and your speed mech, you can immediately move back to the farm, they lose 2 combat power again. And you're actually in fighting shape, generally, if you've taken a bolster action somewhere in there. Early game. So that's the upside of getting your underpass mech second instead of your riverwalk mech second. If you choose to get your riverwalk mech second, you're saying, okay, I'm going to pick up this encounter, but since I need underpass third, otherwise my character is not going to be involved for the rest of the game, I don't have access to disarm until super late. So when will you make this decision instead of getting the underpass mech and just playing standard? Well, typically the neighbor that's going to give you the most trouble is Plania. Plania can oftentimes get a mine and start trying to contest this square, especially if there's a straight line bonus for your structures like there is here. They oftentimes want to get this straight line, and this spot is so important for you that you really can't afford to let them kick you off it for any period of time. So you're going to actually have to get your disarm mech out, which means that going for the Riverwalk mech to pick up the encounter is just not worth it. Alright, now let's talk about exploiting people as Saxony. Now as Saxony, it's your job to punish the mistakes of other players in the game. What are those mistakes? Well, okay, let's talk about Crimea first. Crimea needs to be careful of Saxony in the game. This is their only Riverwalk spot, and as we talked about in the Crimea video, wayfaring out here, wayfaring out here, wayfaring wherever the in fact effectiveness are, is just very, very slow. So typically they always have to get their Riverwalk mech to actually get out onto the board and involved in the game. What does that mean for you? Well, this is a tunnel. If you're getting your disarm mech out third, and they're not out yet, you can actually plop like 2 mechs on here, and Crimea is going to have a very difficult time actually attacking you. It's going to slow their game down heavily. What else can you do with Crimea? Well, sometimes in Crimea games, I've seen this happen for sure, they'll be producing on this mill, or this mountain, with either 1 mech or 0 mechs and some workers. And they won't have anybody here. What does this mean for you? Well, with underpass and speed and your Riverwalk mech, you can actually go straight from here to the mountain here. So this is an exploited spot. If they leave resources basically unattended here, you can attack this spot immediately, assuming they also don't have anything here, and pick up whatever resources are there and immediately move them back to the mountain so they can't retake them. Same thing goes with Plania. Plania's only Riverwalk spot is here. So again, the same thing with the oil here, you can do with the mountain here. A lot of times Plania can actually lose the game if they're not very, very careful about Saxony. I've seen a lot of Plania players, like, they'll get 8 workers or something, and then I've seen this happen too many times. They'll get their Riverwalk mech first, and then they'll Riverwalk all their workers and their mech onto here. Then they'll produce. They'll put 7 steel on this spot. And it's your job as Saxony, in order to get ahead, to immediately swoop in. You'll only need your underpass mech and a mech on here. Or if you have underpass and speed, then you need underpass and speed and a mech anywhere in your starting area, and you can just swoop in with that mech, kick them out back to their base, and you pick up all that steel. And then suddenly, what does Polania do? Well, they started with a Riverwalk mech, which means they don't have speed, which means they need 2 move actions to even get back to the steel. Yeah, that's going to take them a while. This is why one of the reasons you always start with your speed mech. And then you can spend that steel, or you can move it, as we were mentioning, with your underpass mech, immediately back to this mountain so that they can't take it back. What's the other thing with Polania? Well, similar with the thing we were talking about with this mountain tile, you can do with this forest tile. As Polania before, I've had strategies that rely on putting a mill here, and like having maybe like 1 worker and then getting some resources on here so I can get buildings elsewhere on the map. Well, if I do that and I don't have anything on this mountain, Saxon can very easily, with Riverwalk, Speed, and Underpass, and a mech on here, just swoop in and pick up the resources and then leave with them. So this is another tile that's just as vulnerable as this one. So you need to keep an eye out on this tile, this tile, this tile, and this tile. Well, is there any other tiles you really need to keep an eye out for? Yep, it's right here. So as Nords, this is your unsafe tile against Saxon players. As we were talking about, Riverwalk, Speed, and Underpass will allow the Saxon player to immediately sweep in and get onto your mountain. If you leave resources unattended, if you, as the Nord player, or if, as Saxony, if you see resources unattended on this mountain, you can easily swoop in if you have your mechs out and just pick them up and run away with them. So keep in mind this tile, this wood on Polania, this is not too hard to remember. If you ever forget, take a look at Forest and Mountain Riverwalk, and you can figure it out. It's basically any forest or mountain tile in the outer ring, or not next to a lake, right? This is a mountain tile in a base area, but since it's next to a lake, you can't get to it. You can get to this one, you can get to this one, you can get to this one. So these players need to be careful not to make a mistake that involves all-inning on a tunnel or leaving resources unattended on a tile you can riverwalk to. So if you see that as Saxony, take advantage. You're going to make the player upset, and you may say to yourself, well, that's just not worth it to me to make my friends upset. But the thing is, you're playing Saxony. So if you aren't willing to take advantage of other players' mistakes, and that's not on you, that's on them, by the way. If they leave resources unattended on these tiles, that's on them. And if you don't take advantage of it, you're going to fall behind most of the time, if not every time. Because every other player is going to be getting their lists faster than you, unless you did the underpass mech strategy, which we briefly touched on. What else is there as Saxony? Keep in mind, structure bonus for building on tunnels is going to really be something that you can look for. Since with disarm and underpass, anybody trying to fight you on tunnels is basically dooming themselves to losing 4 power at minimum, and past that having to actually take the tile from you. You're gonna have to get a couple bolsters in early. It's just an annoying weakness that you only have 1 combat power to start, and you're the only faction that needs to get on the board to start. In fact, I think that's a flaw in game design, that you only have 1 starting combat power. So yeah, it's going to be annoying, but try and get the resources so you can take the bolster action and take the bottom row action maybe once or twice in the early to mid game. And that's really it. There's not too much more to Saxony's early game, and we covered a lot of things that you're going to need to keep an eye out for while you're playing as Saxony in order to win the game. I hope you guys enjoyed, I hope you guys learned something, and we'll be back with Polania.